Everyone, and welcome to the Center for New American Security. Thank you to those joining us both in person and online. My name is Molly Campbell, Research Assistant with the Defense Program, and I'll be moderating today's panel. This will be a really interesting discussion looking at the strategic value of drones in modern warfare and how both the United States and Taiwan are prioritizing uncrewed technology as a critical deterrent against China. I'll start by introducing our panelists today. Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn is a senior fellow and the director of the defense program here at CNAS. She has a wide research area, but most relevant for the discussion today is her expertise on drone and counter-drone warfare. Hong Lun Tian is a non-resident fellow and deputy director of the National Security Program at the Taiwanese Research Institute for Democracy, Society, and Emerging Technology, or DSET is how I'll be referring to it throughout the event today. Where he leads various strategic portfolios, including on Taiwan-U.S. drone co-production. And last but certainly not least, the Honorable Dr. Eli Ratner is the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs under President Biden and is currently principal at the Marathon Initiative. We will be making time for questions from both our online and in-person audience today. If you're joining online and would like to ask a question, please identify yourself and share your questions in the chat, and we'll try to pepper them in throughout the discussion. And in the last 10 to 15 minutes of our in-person event today, we'll be taking audience questions. So let's first begin by kind of setting the stage of the security scenario. And I'd like to begin by contextualizing the threat to Taiwan from the People's Republic of China. And for years now, many have cited the benchmark years of China's military modernization goals as indicators of when China might invade Taiwan. And for Eli, many analysts now view 2027 as an unlikely window for an invasion scenario. But if you could touch on to why so much of our defense planning and investment decisions are still being driven by this time frame.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, wonderful to be here at CNAS, and really kudos to Stacy and Molly for the incredible work that you all have been doing on this issue of drones and modern warfare, and particularly as it relates to the Taiwan Strait, really sort of best in class of the research coming out of CNAS on this. So very happy to be here learning from you all today. Look, yes, the 2027 date gets a lot of airtime still in Washington. It certainly did while I was in the administration. It was a bit beguiling, but that was because, as you mentioned, Xi Jinping had directed the PLA to be prepared to invade Taiwan, hold the United States at bay by that date. Director of the CIA said that publicly in a congressional hearing. Of course, the folks who study this closely say, look, that's a modernization goal. It's not a go-by date. And our best understanding is still that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership's calculus around this is conditions-based, that they have been aiming toward a short, sharp, low-cost invasion at acceptable cost, and until they feel like they can achieve that, they're going to hold off. So the question of timing has always been, well, I don't think there's ever been a very specific date on the calendar, but rather how are they perceiving U.S. capability, Taiwan capability, U.S. will, and their own capability, and of course the question of when is this going to happen, by which date. There's a lot of agency for the United States and Taiwan in this, and from my perspective, I think a lot of reason for optimism that it will be difficult, but that deterrence in the long run is achievable.
So beyond the timing debate, if we could drill down a little bit on what do you think an invasion strategy would look like, and why is it such a difficult scenario for Taiwan and also the United States?
Yeah, sure. So what would a potential invasion of Taiwan look like, or a conflict scenario? Of course, the Defense Department, U.S. intelligence agencies develop what we call an ECOA, an enemy course of action. It's constantly updated and refreshed over time. Not going to get into the specific intelligence aspects of that here, but there are elements of it that are well known in the open source, to include likely some kind of pre-conflict shaping phase, some kind of maritime interdiction or quarantine element potentially associated with an invasion. Of course, an air and missile campaign, what is often referred to as a joint firepower strike phase. Then the amphibious invasion itself that obviously folks are quite focused on. And then, of course, once a landing does or does not occur, potentially a urban warfare, seizing of the island, stabilization phase as well. So those are the elements, and phasing exactly what order they go in and which gets greater emphasis is up for debate. But in terms of PRC advantages, why is this so difficult? Some of these are quite evident. Obviously, from a U.S. perspective, the geography makes it incredibly difficult. We have a long way to go. They do not. Another advantage that China has, of course, is its modernization has been, if not singularly, very focused on this scenario specifically. And so they have been developing the capabilities, huge missile arsenal, long-range strike, as well as space and cyber capabilities, and of course, more recently, a whole suite of UAV capabilities. So they're modernizing their military toward this specific scenario, whereas for the United States, we're obviously thinking globally. And then the other advantage that China has is that in most or all of these scenarios, they're going to have the initiative. It's going to be when they decide to conduct an invasion, and that creates challenges associated with indications and warning and others. So there are inherent advantages for the PRC. I will say, of course, this wasn't your question, and I won't give it a long answer, but Taiwan as the defender has huge advantages as well, in some ways almost greater advantages if we look through the lens of deterrence. And I think, again, why deterrence is achievable. It's not that China's advantages are so overwhelming that this is a lost cause. I really don't think that's the case.
Yeah, great, and we'll definitely touch on the deterrent points as we continue the conversation. But moving towards more current, this is perspective looking at what might happen, looking at current conflicts, and Ukraine is often the main point of comparison, particularly when talking about uncrewed systems and countering uncrewed systems. So for Stacy and for Hong-Lun, if you could speak to, for Stacy, what lessons from Ukraine are most transferable to the Taiwan theater, and then Hong-Lun, what has Taiwan, watching this conflict, what have they taken away? How have the government military adapted their approach and understanding with specific emphasis on uncrewed systems?
Sure. So I think that when you look at Ukraine, there are a lot of important lessons that are directly transferable to Taiwan, and in particular that could enable Taiwan to mount a very effective defense. And if needed, though, would also serve as a great deterrent strategy that would potentially dissuade China from ever trying to undertake a large-scale invasion. So the first one and most obvious is the accessibility and the affordability of drones of all types has fundamentally transformed the battlefield, enabling deep strikes and attacks in the close fight that were not previously capable. And it's not just strikes, it's surveillance, it's providing more situational awareness. The battlefield, there's a lot more understanding at the front lines about what is going on right around them than there was before. So this is pretty profound, and you see its impact most decidedly on the Ukrainian front lines, where offensives have become very, very difficult. And that's one of the other big lessons that I do think is transferable to Taiwan, is that it's always hard to go on the offensive. You do have the initiative, as Eli pointed out, but defenders have certain advantages, particularly if they take the time to put in place prepared defenses. And when you combine that with Taiwan's geography and the fact that amphibious assaults are one of the most difficult types of operations that one could ever undertake, where forces have to actually assemble en masse and expose themselves. There's nowhere to hide if you're approaching in a beach. And that means that drones could be really effective at attriting those ships and those forces as they try to move towards it and actually stopping the assault at the beach from succeeding. I would argue that drones are supplements, not substitutes for existing weapons. They're going to provide mass in the way that folks have been talking about. Mike Horowitz always says precise mass, but they are not the exact same capability as long-range missiles or other short-range weapons that forces have. And it's really when they've been used together that you're seeing the greatest effect. The other important factor to keep in mind is that this is a two-sided fight. China has invested very heavily in uncrewed systems of all types and is also watching what's going on in Ukraine. And it's not that there's one technology that is going to provide a silver bullet to either side. Both are going to use it, and there are going to be these constant adaptations that have to occur in terms of determining who actually prevails on the battlefield. You didn't ask me this, but I'm going to say anyway. I think there are some really important differences, and we highlighted this in our Swarms Over the Strait report. Obviously, it's a maritime theater. I would imagine uncrewed surface vehicles, drone boats, underwater vehicles playing a larger role, as well as drones with sensors and capabilities to attack ships. The distances are huge, and that is really disadvantageous for the U.S. The U.S. needs drones of a different class than what we've typically seen in Ukraine. Taiwan can take advantage of shorter range drones like the Ukrainians have and use them quite effectively, I believe. One of the other big differences to keep in mind is that China's the major source of all of the drones in Ukraine, whether it's the subcomponents or the actual out-of-the-box systems, and that's something that obviously wouldn't be available to Taiwan or the United States, so weaning themselves off Chinese commercial subcomponents and supply chains is really important.
So let me start with that. Thank you for hosting this panel. It's a very important issue to have a discussion here. And I think that the point I will start is that from the point that Stacy just made, that Taiwan has the advantage as a defender. And what we learned from Ukrainian is very core of that is that the unmanned system is not a substitute. It's a supplement to traditional conventional weaponry systems. And we integrate it into our layered defense architecture right now. And actually that for Taiwan recent year, we actually start to thinking about how can we pair the drone or unmanned systems with traditional weaponry systems. And this means that we would not giving up, continue updating our conventional air, naval, or army weaponry systems. We are using drones to basically supplement those systems. So, and one of the recent developments back in Taiwan is that actually 4 of our armed forces divisions all established their own UAV training center to ensure that we have enough personnel to operate those drones when we have the ability to deploy that directly to our militaries. And then another one I want to bring up is that, just like Stacy said, China now have the dominance of the supply on a lot of different components that use in drones. So that is very critical for Taiwan for us to actually starting to gradually building up a non-risk supply chain to basically make sure that way before the contingency happens, we already have the capacities to manufacturing enough and good quality components and drone models. They can be integrated into our layered defense strategies.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Rockner, do you want to kind of touch on what China seems to have taken from the war in Ukraine, kind of on the flip side of the previous question?
Yeah, and I think it'll be a lot of the same versions of a lot of the same issues we've already heard. And of course, there are a lot of lessons to learn from Ukraine in terms of Russian strategy and operations, in terms of Ukrainian defense, in terms of the international response. I think a lot of this is shaping China's thinking about a potential Taiwan contingency. For purposes of today's discussion, maybe just highlight 3, one of which is already Stacy described quite well, which is China's own investment in a full suite of unmanned capabilities that's sort of across the spectrum of operations. So thinking about the different stages of the conflict, the different elements of the operations. And as both panelists have reiterated here, I think sometimes folks have in their heads sometimes that it's going to be like a drone war, like drones on drones swarming against each other. Maybe there will be some of that, but I think by and large, as we've heard here, the way the PLA is thinking about these as force multipliers and enablers of the missions that other capabilities are already doing, whether it's from ISR to strike to other logistics and others. So full integration of that across the spectrum, across the domains, across the elements of the invasion. That'll be one, the role of autonomy. I think second would be the potential for protraction, really borne out in the fact that the Russians probably hoping for a quicker victory. A lot of attention on the Taiwan scenario on the U.S. side as well has gone to thinking about just an initial wave of an invasion. And what we've really seen emphasis on inside the PRC system is thinking about national resilience and the potential for protraction. And in this context, what it means is a focus not just on, you know, what do you need on week 1, week 2, week 3, but how do you think about capacity in a longer term, and how do you think about production and production capability as actually part of your strategy? So that would be maybe a second lesson. And then third would be, sort of interestingly, given how difficult and costly this has been for Russia, is there another way? And I think a renewed focus and emphasis in the PRC system on high-end coercion scenarios, whether it's quarantine or blockade or other forms of coercion that would force the capitulation or a movement inside Taiwan below the level of major invasion. And of course, definitely potential role. We're already seeing it in unmanned capabilities in that strategy as well. So those would just be a few that I think we're seeing already playing out.
Yeah, certainly. And to pull on the second point you made about production, and I think Hong Lun can really speak to this. DSET over the summer published an excellent report on Chinese indigenous drone manufacturing. I want to give you an opportunity to speak to that a bit. And kind of, if you could go to, you know, what your government has said about, you know, developing a drone production capacity to withstand protracted conflict, you know, so, and what's actually been invested.
Yeah, sure. So I think that the first response I want to make is that it's really important to acknowledge that the war will not end it within several days. So after the initial several days, when we have the first few wave of attack and defense, the way that Taiwan defends itself will change, because that is matter on how many munition we have, how many spare part we have, how many capacity we left can continue repair, continue manufacturing those spare parts for our drones. So it will going to change. So that is why Taiwanese government's starting to thinking about how can we make sure everything is self-efficient, that we can make it locally, to make sure that Taiwan can continue to fight our own fight. And back to the what does our government try to invest here is that our government actually set up a pretty clear goal, is that we want to, by 2028, we want to have an annual output reach 180,000 drones per year. That is not enough at all. If from the lesson that we learned from Ukrainian, but that is the short-term goal that's set by Taiwanese governments. And right now, that our report estimate that is roughly 10,000 units per year. Right now, that is our current capacity based on the 2024 estimations. But if we look into into an indirect way, which like if we look into the export of drones from Taiwan actually going rapidly in 2025, and till by the end of September of this year, we export more than 45,000 drones to United States and European country. And speaking about how governments actually do to make sure that we can achieve the goal of 2028, actually that in 2024, our governments received the first large batch of their purchase is around 3,500 drones. And by July 2025, our Armament Bureau announced another big procurements around 50,000 drones that were going to be delivered in 2027 and 2028. And so by that, over the next 5 years, there will be more than 100,000 drones demand directly from government procurement, this including the 50,000 for military use, another 50,000 for public safety purpose and public safety sectors. So that with that being said, that although the goal is very clear, but right now the policy is still like in a two tier factions. So the first tier, we all talk about small drones, FPV drones used in Ukrainian battlefield. For that kind of drones, Taiwanese government want to localize the manufacturing of those drones in Taiwan, including the key part, including spare part, including those batteries, propellers, and the motors. So that is the first tier of the policy. And the second tier of policy is that we still try to cooperate with our airline, especially United States, to actually get our hands on operating those larger drones, like the one we already purchased several years ago, but not yet received.
Sky Guardian.
The Sky Guardian, MQ-9B Sky Guardian. So that is the example for that. We want to operate them. We want to know how to cooperate with airline by using those drones and the intelligence acquired by those drones. But we are not seeking a fully localized manufacturing capacities for those larger drones right now. But we try to be like a repair maintenance hub in the Indo-Pacific region for that.
And I think you touched on a big issue with relying on the U.S. for exporting particularly these major drones. I think it's been 4 years at this point, the order for the Sky Guardians to be delivered to Taiwan.
Yes, it have been several years.
Yes, it's been quite a long time since those have gotten delivered. But this is really interesting, and I think really touches on kind of the emphasis on small UAS, FPV drones, and commercial systems. So I'm going to kind of combine a few questions here. But before that, Stacy, can you kind of like take a step back and talk about why commercial drones, kind of the tier one that he introduced, is so important to, I think, Taiwan specifically and to the U.S., as we saw with the Replicator initiative, is something that we've also really struggled to do ourselves. The United States is struggling to get these production lines up to have the same capacity that Taiwan is working towards.
Yeah, as Molly has shown with her work and her drone data set, you know, the U.S. has been at the forefront of large Group 4, Group 5 drones, the medium altitude, high altitude type systems like the Sky Guardian or the Global Hawk, and those are great, and I think they're very useful in terms of peacetime and day-to-day operations and gathering intelligence and surveillance, but those aren't really the drones that have played a large role in Ukraine at all. And those drones are much more expensive and tend to be acquired in much smaller numbers. They've also been subject to the Missile Technology Control Regime, which imposes restrictions on them because they could be used to deliver larger payloads. And this administration, as well as the Biden administration and the first Trump administration, have all tried to roll that back a little bit with some success, though it's still there, and just the foreign military sales process taking a long time for the U.S. So I think, you know, Taiwan developing a capability to build and produce itself some of these smaller drones makes a lot of sense. The commercial component is really important because it goes back to the first point that I made about the accessibility and affordability of drones. Drone warfare is fundamentally a cost competition. And we've seen that almost no system on a real battlefield is truly survivable, let alone a drone. And you don't want to invest a tremendous amount in most of the drones that you're going to use because you're going to lose them. Whether they're intended to be reusable or whether they're one-way attack drones or loitering munitions, they need to be affordable so you can have a lot of them. And a big part of drone warfare has been saturation attacks, and I think this is something that Taiwan should embrace because of some of the other differences that are likely to emerge with respect to a conflict between China and Taiwan versus what we've seen with Russia and Ukraine, in that there would be, I think, a lot more disruptions to satellite communications in that conflict, which means that some of the means of controlling these drones won't be available, and they're going to have to be more autonomous. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Terminator super intelligent autonomy. Relatively simple forms of autonomy could suffice that can find targets and hit them. But I would argue, and well, we have argued, that ships are more vulnerable to saturation-style attacks, right? They have limited magazines on them in terms of defensive interceptors, and that if you fire lots of weapons at them, that they will eventually run out. And that is something that Taiwan could exploit if it can buy enough of them. But that requires driving the cost of the drones down, and that is either done by adapting commercial drones for the very small ones or using commercial subcomponents, which are produced at scale and achieve greater economies of scale and therefore just cost less.
So the main issue with that, however, is that that is nearly solely dominated by the PRC, both the production of commercial drones and the subcomponents, and that's something you touch on in the report. So Dr. Ratner and Hung Lung, if you could speak a bit to, Dr. Ratner, you did speak to kind of the Replicator initiative and the attempts by the U.S. to establish non-red supply chains and its own indigenous drone production. And Hung Lung, if how Taiwan has kind of beginning to work around this and, maybe accepting greater costs to have those more secure supply chains for the small UAS.
Happy to go first. I mean, as it relates to the Replicator initiative, this was an initiative inside the Biden administration to try to accelerate the development and acquisition of drones and get them into the hands of the warfighter, certain amount by day certain, all the way from sort of deciding which capabilities are going to invest in, et cetera. Maybe just I'll add layers of complexity as opposed to just because the supply chain issue is a really knotty issue in and of itself, but to the question of sort of how's it going and what are all the elements that one needs to develop to succeed around this. And if you were asking the question of how's the United States doing in sort of answering the call of developing this capability, some of the things that I would look at, the checklist I guess that I would have in my mind, number one would be just the resourcing question of, is the U.S. military serious about sort of man, train, and equip at the degree necessary that we believe is aligned with sort of the prioritization? I think heretofore the answer to that is probably no. And so good to be kind of moving out and pushing in this direction. But what would right look like in terms of from the military departments and from a budget perspective to actually try to do this from a resourcing perspective? So that would be one question. I think another one, just looking back on my own participation in some of the Replicator initiative efforts, is how to think about this issue of sort of rapid technological change. Because I think even if you go back and talk to folks who are at the very beginning of that, the suite of capabilities that they would look at, I think today they would say that was right at the time. Yeah. We've kind of moved beyond that now, and that gets to the point of thinking about not just about acquisition and inventory, but also about production and adaptation, and how do we think about the interplay between those two? Which one should we be really focused on? What should we be putting our resources after? It's not just about picking winners on day one and sort of buying a whole bunch of those and just putting them away till you need them. Third, and I know you all have done a little bit of thinking on this here, more than a little bit, is just the question of concepts of employment, concepts of operations, because in a funny way, this is one of those instances where the technology has gotten in front of our understanding of exactly how we're going to use it. So how are the planners catching up in terms of thinking about how are we actually going to use these things, and how is that going to inform questions about acquisition and resourcing and everything else? And then finally, from somebody who was managing a regional portfolio, there's a whole set of policy and diplomatic questions that go along with this, because we're probably not going to be flying these things out of California. So
we could try.
We could try. They got to be pretty long distance. I mean, the ones we're talking about here. Yeah. So where are they actually going to be? Who's going to own them? Where are they going to be stored? Who's going to train and maintain them? And even location questions, really important diplomatic policy questions that also need to be integrated on top of just, hey, we're playing with a chessboard here and sort of a risk game. It's got to be in the more real world about that diplomatic and strategy. So those are all elements that are going to have to fold on top of just the developing the capability question.
Yep. So I think from Taiwanese side that there are several very key elements there. The first one is actually our drone development policies inspired by Replicator a lot. So we actually try to move faster in the acquisitions process to make sure that those newer generation drones can be used by our military for no matter for combating purpose, operational purpose, or the training purpose. But it's actually pretty hard because that if we only take one point out of that is about software. The software update is super fast, and if you do not have the ability to actually update those softwares from your vendors, or you do not have that kind of acquisition process in place that actually make this update possible, it will be very hard for our military to actually get their hands on the newest model and software of drones. And the second one, I want to touch on what Stacy just talking about. What about we use commercial drones or commercial subcomponents instead of focusing on military-grade, military-use drone and components. And that is what exactly Taiwan is trying to do. So that is why we bring in the private sectors. We try to make them develop their own commercial-grade, commercial-use drone first, and try to sell them as like trusted platform, trusted systems. And then after those capacity building up, we're starting to thinking about how can we use those commercial drones in various different missions for our military. Mm-hmm. So the key point here is not about how doable those drones is. It's about how many drones we can operate at the same time. And the third part I want to touch on that what is some of the key barrier right now that Taiwan's drone industrial bases still need to conquer. Mm-hmm. The first one is about the core technology. We call that the 3 chips and 2 software. Those is critical subsystems within the drones that actually make drones working. And although Taiwan is very good at chip making and ICT industry, but we actually do not have actual know-how and hands-on experience on those chips and softwares using a drone, so that is a barrier for us. Another one is echo to Stacy's points that we need to catch up on how can we use the advanced AI on those drones, especially the AI that can directly work on edge. On the drones, without using the cloud computing, without using any internet connections, that make sure that our drones can operate on themselves doing the missions and in the jamming environments. And the last one is because that we want to develop the commercial drone first, so we need to make sure that there's a market for our companies to actually sell and get their things on the ground and test those drones. So actually Taiwanese government's policy is trying to open up the international public sector market for our drone makers, so making them to have a chance to actually test run their drones. So that is why we observe a lot of export of Taiwan's drone is directly to Poland and directly to Poland, so and Czech Republic. So I think that is one of the examples that Taiwan is trying to make sure our drone is field tested and we have a feedback loop can continue to update our drones.
So on your point on exports, and one thing you identify in the report as that's kind of inhibiting Taiwan's drone industry, particularly in the United States, is the fact that not all Taiwanese drone manufacturers are cleared vendors in the U.S., that is changing with Thunder Tiger being on the blue UAS list just this September. So if you could talk to kind of what are the next steps to kind of getting more folks cleared to open up the U.S. market to kind of compete with DJI's global dominance?
Yeah, I think that for that, first of all, that Taiwanese drone maker is not looking for competing head-to-head with DJI on commercial markets, because that is not what we anticipate them to do. I think that for Taiwanese drone maker, the competitions they anticipate is in the public sector, especially in the public safety sectors, because that we can provide trusted and transparent platform and system that ensure that our customers can feel safe to transmit those confidential informations and intelligence on our systems. So I think that is the main point.
That's very interesting. I know Stacy and I have worked with former Representative Elise Stefanik's office discussing the name of the act that I cannot remember, but about regulating DJI in the United States, particularly in that public safety, public sector role. So definitely interesting movement with that issue in the U.S. We're going to take a big step back and bring it to deterrent, so hard pivot. So Stacy, thinking more broadly, kind of with all we know, we've been talking about with small drones, SUAS, and kind of how do drones fit into, the asymmetric capabilities that Taiwan is developing for its defense in a Chinese invasion scenario, and why was this, less escalatory than, say, other approaches?
Sure. So I think this harkens back to what Eli said initially about this not being a lost cause and how difficult it would be for China to undertake a large-scale invasion operation. And Taiwan has adopted an asymmetric defensive strategy that a number of folks have been arguing for many years now, focused on missiles, land-based missiles like the Harpoon coastal defense missile, which you're supposed to buy, your own HK-2 and 3 missiles, and then there's mines as well, sea mines, land mines, and I think this is where you can connect some dots to what we've seen in Ukraine in terms of creating a sea denial area for Taiwan that would make it very hard for China to actually get its forces to the beaches by supplementing those higher-end anti-ship cruise missiles with a bunch of cheaper long-range drones. And these don't have to be the most sophisticated drones. In fact, you don't want them to be. You want a lot of them because there's I think it's 400 Harpoons that Taiwan's buying. You want thousands of the cheaper long-range drones that can go out and flood and sort of slowly attrit Chinese ships as they get closer, because China has to actually seize a beach initially if it can't grab a port, and hopefully it wouldn't be able to do that, and ferry troops over. And this is a really hard task, and one of the areas that the Chinese military still remains seriously deficient is in sea lift, military sea lift capability. So if you can sink some of those ships or seriously disable them, you can make this very difficult. And progressively, as Chinese forces move closer, drones, including drone boats, akin to the way that the Ukrainians have used them in the Black Sea, can reach out and harass those ships. You can have cross-domain attacks. The drone boats might release smaller aerial drones. They might launch rockets. They might have air defense missiles on them. And if you add with that fairly dense sea minefields that Chinese forces have to navigate, have to clear, they have to slow things down, move very deliberately, and that provides you with more and more opportunities to attrit them from the air and the sea and potentially undersea over time. So this would be a deterrence by denial strategy, which I think is the soundest one, because if deterrence fails, then you can defend yourself and potentially repel the attack instead of relying on ideas about deterrence by punishment and inflicting costs on the enemy. It would be less escalatory because it's focused on the invasion force, whether those are the ships, the troops, or the aircraft that are attacking Taiwan, than attacking the Chinese mainland directly. And it actually could stop them at the beaches and prevent a successful invasion.
Awesome. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative. We've gotten some awesome questions from the online audience, so please, if you have any additional ones, send them into the chat. But this is from our very own Jake Stokes, and I think that for Stacy and Hung-Won, I think this will be a bit to y'all's expertise. So Jake writes, China has significant electronic warfare capabilities that can target drones. How much do these capabilities matter, and what, if anything, are the United States and Taiwan doing to take into account the EW threat when designing, building, and fielding drones to thwart a PRC invasion of Taiwan?
Yep. So let me start with that. So I think that is a very important question, is because that both Taiwan and China are developing their own drone technology and using them in the military operation. So we can anticipate that there's a lot of jamming and counter-UAS system deployed in the battlefield. So first of all, how Taiwan can tackle on this issue is that we try to make sure that all of our drones is not the expensive one, that we cannot deploy a lot of them, and we will feel very bad when we lose any one of them. So that is first. So that is kind of echo to what Stacy just mentioned, is that we need a bunch of the drones they can deploy on the battlefield, and the cost should not be too high. So that is the first strategy. So use the number to overcome those counter U.S. measurements. And the second one is that it's really touched on the very core issue in our research, is that how can we cooperate with our airline in those jamming environments, and do a lot and do at least some of the co-operations in battlefield. So actually that right now is unclear how Taiwanese military are going to use the identification for fan of foes on those drones. How can we coordinate between different airlines drones fleet, and so we do not shoot each other down on the battlefield. So that is another issue that is a way to tackle this issue, but not essentially addressed. And the third one is that we want our drones to have the ability to neutralize another drones, especially Chinese drones. But for that part, the technology limit is there, and we hope that we can cooperate with our ally, our partner like United States, to acquire those advanced counter-U.S. technology that we can use on the battlefield.
On jamming, I already said I would expect even more jamming of satellite communications and things that have been somewhat restrained or intermittent in Ukraine, because it is not a straight U.S.-Russia or Russia-NATO war. They haven't been quite as active in all aspects of space as we might expect in this scenario. So I think that Taiwan's best strategy is to rely more on autonomy on drones, and fairly simple autonomy, have onboard sensors that can discriminate and identify a ship, can declare a maritime exclusion zone, have these drones that can go off on their own, find ship, hit ship. Don't try to make it complicated. Don't try to find the most high-end ships. You just sort of flood the environment and make sure that you are resilient by having a closed kill chain where it's one system that's going off and doing it at the farthest distances. The challenge for China is that as they get closer, they're not going to be able to jam everything with their standoff aerial jammers, and those small line-of-sight drones and some of those small line-of-sight missiles or rockets are things that they're not going to be as easily jammed. There will be tactical jammers, but you might be able to just have autonomous terminal guidance on some of the systems, the way that the Ukrainians have, that can go the last mile when an operator has guided the drone to the target and hit it. And there's a lot in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum that I think folks need to figure out, because China's going to want to be operating its own small drones too, and they can't do that if they're jamming consistently. So it would certainly play a large role, but I think this is why you move away from exquisite, very complicated kill chains and assuming you're going to pass information from one system to another beyond line of sight.
Great, thank you. Not necessarily a hardware solution, more of a employment solution. So we're going to pivot to audience questions. Jacob is going to be walking around with the microphone, so if you could just raise your hand and I will call on you. If you just introduce yourself and direct to who your question is. If nobody has any questions, we can also continue otherwise.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I run Helsing's U.S. business. So a lot of different themes came up during the conversation. Obviously, production is one, supply chain is another. The fact that, we're seeing Ukraine as a protracted conflict, obviously they'll be the same in the Pacific. So I'm wondering, maybe this question's to you, Stacy, but when you've been studying the conflict in Ukraine, from a production standpoint, have there been certain processes that you think can be lifted and shifted that allow us to better reconstitute capabilities, have a maybe lighter footprint, and draw on I guess it's tough when you've got the supply chain component as well. But are there any lessons learned there around production supply chain that you think can be lifted or shifted?
You're probably better suited to answer this than I am, but I'll take a stab at it anyway. I think that one of the really interesting things about Ukraine's production is sort of how heterogeneous it is right now. But that's actually been, I think, a problem in some ways. In some ways, and it's an advantage. You have a lot of different systems, and that means that there's some resilience there. Your enemy has to counter more of them. But they haven't been able to scale production in the same way that Russia has. What has impressed me the most is and what I think we should remember with drones is it's not just the frame, whether it's an aircraft or the ship or the submarine that we're really focused on. It's going to be the brains of it and some of the subcomponents. And there have been really ingenious ways that Ukrainian companies have developed subcomponents that work in the face of jamming or allow them to. I mean, jamming's been the major issue that they've worked around, whether it's autonomous navigation, that is optical terrain matching, which would be harder in the ocean because the ocean doesn't have many fixed features, but that they're developing these and they're cheap and they work and they're battle proven. And I feel like more generally, I think that nations that don't want to rely more broadly on red supply chains are going to have to share these lessons, these subcomponents, and create a shared demand for these different systems to be able to drive the costs down. So that would be across NATO and Europe, the United States, other allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region, and that by working together, sharing, discussing these, and finding the best pieces, parts, and letting each nation sort of specialize in what they do best, that they might be able to not match DJI and sort of China's dominance of the market, because that's probably not going to be overcome, but at least be producing really good products at a reasonable price point that they could afford a lot of them.
Hi, my name is Amy, and I'm from the American Enterprise Institute. Since we were just speaking about electronic warfare and jamming and whatnot, and as we know that the evolution of warfare is happening so quickly, I was just wondering, since you all know way more than I do about drones, how you see fiber optic developments and also fiber optic drones in a maritime setting. We haven't seen a lot of it, but just wondering if you can clue us into kind of any developments specifically there that are happening.
So let me take that question. So I think that the fiber optic FPV drones in what we see in Ukrainian is because that the environment on the battlefield there is really good for this kind of FPV drones to conduct the strikes directly on targets. But if you turn the stage from Ukraine into Taiwan, especially the maritime environments, it will be very critical to understand how hard it is to operate the drones on the on ocean area, especially when there is some weather kicking in. And in terms of fiber optics, yes, that is a very good way to counter jamming, because that you do not, there's wireless drones. You do not need any wireless communications with the drones. But I would say that that is not the best way out. The best way out still that what Stacy just mentioned, that if we can shorten the kill chain and we can make sure that just like a rocket or a missile, the drones that launch from the ship can directly search in the target and hit on the target, and that's it. That will be the best solution if we are talking about maritime situation.
I'd agree. I would just add that I think you see with every adaptation and attempt to respond to different counters that they have strengths and weaknesses, and you want to have a variety of options. My understanding is fiber optic drones don't work well over water. That if they go in, then that's going to pull the drone in, and they have other disadvantages in terms of, you know, potentially getting tangled in different foliage or just features that are out there, and they fly slower than the other ones. That being said, I would argue that Taiwanese defenders and ground forces that are going to be at the beaches or farther back in echelons want to have some of them, but they're still pretty expensive, and fiber wire is mostly manufactured in China. So you want some of them because that means they can't just turn, even if there are jammers on and it's on land, then you have some means to reach out and attack, and there's no one way for them to entirely shut your drone operations down, but they by themselves, I think, have more limited applicability to the sea denial piece of the fight.
Hi, my name is Tim. I'm a visiting fellow in Rand Corporation, but today is my personal question. We talk a lot about the drones, but specifically, it's more about UAVs, and I want you to discuss about a little bit to UUV underwater. Unmanned underwater vehicle. I just news about the Australian. They cooperated with Andrew, and they will massive production lots of UUVs next year. And I think that's an also very important asymmetric warfare capability for Taiwan, especially as Dr. Stacy just mentioned. If their amphibious landing fleets cannot land, it can be destroyed by the UUVs, and it patrols underwater for a very long time, just concealed there, and wait for the right time to attack those amphibious fleets. Then that's really helpful for Taiwan. So what do you think about the UUV, and also for the home? Because when we talk about the massive production, one possibility is from the commercial use, right? But for this kind of UUV, I think only the military needs that, or maybe someone who like to fish the deep fish. I don't know. So what do you think of that? Thank you.
I mean, UUVs, I think, could play a really important role, and you're right, they are potentially a very important weapon because they're hard to find. I would argue that the ones that Taiwan might want for this type of strategy are not necessarily the same ones as like Ghost Shark, which is pretty large, because anything big is easier to find and kill. So smaller systems, and you already have UUVs that are used for ocean deep water surveillance and to monitor things like underwater cables. So there is sort of commercial applicability, certainly like Coast Guard and military as well, and having some of those as kind of an outermost picket line to first tell you if a fleet is coming towards you and where it is, where they could communicate in a low bandwidth way, just the critical information, fleet is coalescing here. Some of them could be strike attack options, so they're essentially autonomous torpedoes. You know, you could imagine them being smart minefields that can reseed and come out and sort of fill lanes that have previously been cleared, which would create significant problems for the attacker. And then there are sort of like the larger, maybe a large UUV that has a cheap torpedo on it, certainly would be useful. I do think in general the ethos behind the asymmetric strategy of lots of small things, right, that keeps the cost down, that you can afford to lose, and that are distributed and harder to find is a key part of it, though.
Yeah, so first of all, I think that for the UUV, Taiwanese government policy is started from UAV and then expanded to USV, and then we are going to talk about UUV. And as for the massive production for UUV, I think it's just like Stacy just said, that it's really depending on which kind of UUV you are talking about. If you're talking about the smart water mine, that is one kind of UUV, and that can be scale up very quickly. We can produce a lot of smart mine at a very short period of time. But if you're talking about large UUV like unmanned submarine like Ghost Shark, that is whole another story. We are not going to mass productions those stuff in a very short period of time. But I think that back to my comment previously about how can we use the commercial grade drones on those military use, I think the key point is that which kind of mission you anticipate those drones or UUV to do. And we need to set up the missions and the purpose first. And then we think about what kind of commercial grade products that in our manufacturing capacity, they can fit that need. If there's one, then there's green light, we can scale up and mass produce a lot of that. And right now, what Taiwan is trying to do is that we try to stockpile ourselves of the ability to manufacture as many as possible different kind of UXV. No matter it's UAV, USV, or UUV, we want to get those capacity. And we want to make sure that no matter which type of missions we want those UXV to do, we have the capacity in-house, and we can scale it up very quickly.
Hello, I'm Fanny from DC. Thank you for this amazing event. And I have a I have a question for Dr. Reiner, because we're talking about replicator, right? And when Taiwan and when DC research on the development of the small drones, we're interested in knowing the lesson learned in America's experience in development. So if you have to advise like Taiwanese government or Taiwanese society in piloting or developing the small drones, how will you advise us? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure we have all the answers based on our own experience, but I think I would come back to some of the challenges that I described earlier. I mean, number one, you got to focus on the resourcing. I think Taiwan is taking some really big, bold steps in terms of some of the proposals on the table now for the defense budget and the special budget, pushing overall defense spending above 5%, and President Lai talking about that as a floor, not a ceiling. So I think encouraging signs on the resourcing front. I think the broader challenge, and I saw this in the U.S. system, but I think, to be frank, saw it in the Taiwan system as well, is that sometimes there is, and not from experts, and we've heard the more well-rounded discussion today, but sometimes there is a near singular bureaucratic fixation on just developing and acquiring the system, and that is so obviously not enough, right? I mean, you need the concepts of operations, you need to be thinking through some of the policy elements. I mean, just thinking about this question, I was reflecting on this conversation on the USVs on the surface. That raises a lot of questions for Taiwan about, for instance, decisions around mobilization, INW questions. If you're thinking about, yes, we could all sit down on a game board and think about how these capabilities are going to be really effective to lay a minefield. But the bureaucratic decisions about at what point and under what indications and warning do you actually do something like that, because the timing around these decisions is going to be so vital. So there is a policy architecture that needs to go around these systems that needs to be developed. There's again a concepts of operations, and I think both of our systems at times have been racing forward toward capabilities without full understanding of how we might be employing them, so there needs to be more work on that. To the questions earlier on jamming, there has been, on balance, more attention to the UAV question than there has been to the counter UAV question, which is going to be equally as important. Sometimes, I mean, folks are focused on that and people understand that's a real challenge, but I think if you look at the policy discussion and the industry discussion and sort of the government discussion, it tends to be sort of on the offense and less on the defense. So I think and not to mention all of the other capabilities you would need, sort of the full cycle of capabilities to be able to collect the data you're getting, to be able to share it, to be able to assess it and analyze it. So there's a lot more to it than, do I have a a bird that I can put in the air. So I think thinking about what does the actual entirety of the ecosystem look like, and even as we are moving as fast as we can on the pure technology front, are we tending to all those other elements with the sort of intensity and focus that we should be?
No, exactly. And I'll use this as a shameless plug for Countering the Swarm, Stacy and I's recent report on countering drones. So if you are interested, go check it out. There's some hard copies right outside. I think we have time for about one more question if we have anyone in the audience who would still like to ask a question. So right here.
Trey Meeks from the Asia Group. We've talked a lot about D-Day deterrence. Could we talk just a little bit about day-to-day deterrence and some potential use cases to push back against the illegal, coercive, aggressive, deceptive operations we've seen pretty routinely from the Chinese Navy, Coast Guard, and maritime militia?
Dr. Ratner, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll start. It's a hugely important question, and it was one that we were wrestling with 2021, 2022, 2023, as we saw the PLA, China Coast Guard, maritime militia, very clearly using air and maritime coercion and interventions to not only intimidate the Taiwan people, but also to draw out Taiwan's military wear down readiness. It just wasn't doing good things for the Taiwan military to have to be responding one-to-one. So it initiated a conversation. Trey, you're asking exactly the right question, which is rather than using conventional capabilities of which are expensive and old and Taiwan doesn't have enough of, are there other ways? And I think we started making some progress on that, and how can you use these capabilities. I think the challenge, I would say, so the answer is yes, you have to do that. Taiwan has started doing that. It needs to do a lot more. I think the challenge in part is that much of China's day-to-day coercion is as much about politics as it is about military, and there is a need at times for Taiwan itself to be able to demonstrate big capability and frankly to provide literal physical blocking functions. And so it isn't necessarily, well, it may be sufficient from an ISR perspective to use an unmanned vessel rather than a bigger surface ship. They may not be achieving the political essential element of signaling both to the PRC but also to the Taiwan people about the degree to which the Taiwan government understands and is sort of in control of the space around Taiwan. So it's a long way of saying it's exactly the right thing to be doing, but I am also sympathetic to Taiwanese policymakers who say, we hear you and we're going to do some of that, but that doesn't mean that we can just scrap our entire conventional military and we're going to be able to do all this with small, low-cost drones.
Yeah, I think that my answer to that question is yes, we need a day-to-day deterrence. And I think that that day-to-day deterrence is not built based on our Navy or our Army. It's based on our Coast Guard. So basically, what Taiwanese Coast Guard are doing now, day by day, is try to let the Chinese Coast Guard and their fishing boat fleet know that we know you are there. We know what you are doing. And how can we do this? We cannot rely on AIS because they can like fake their AIS signals, like they can fake a Coast Guard ship into a fish boat, right? So what we use is we combine the satellite image, combine our own fish boat, observe those ships on the sea, and as well as those drones that flying out from the deck of our Coast Guard ship to actually create combined intelligence information chain to deterrence Chinese gray zone tactic to let them know that we know you are there, we know what you are doing, be careful, we are watching.
Can I just say one more thing about this, which a question that I always had for Taiwan friends was maybe also not just be thinking so defensively about this, and what would a asymmetric salami slicing strategy look like for Taiwan back in the other direction using some of the capabilities that we're talking about today. And I think that hasn't necessarily been explored in the Taiwan Strait nor in the South China Sea or elsewhere, that the United States and our allies and partners ought to be just pushing back and not just playing whack-a-mole against PRC coercion.
Yeah, I think that. Thank you for that question. I think for that is that just what I'm saying, that we will continue publish and make their gray zone tactic transparent to the global community, to that everyone know that how frequent those Chinese gray zone tactics is, because that in the past time that we do not very transparent on those Chinese coalitions around Taiwan, but right now that we actually pretty transparent on that, we will release press material, we will release photo, video footage on that. So basically what Taiwan do as like a reaction on that is that we try to make everything transparent. And I think that the UAV will be a very huge part of that, because we do not want to risk our own soldiers on those type of missions.
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, we are over time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for such an interesting conversation.